sti capelli.
Partiti.
Okay, so I have to say Huadien here. So good morning and welcome to the 15th lecture included in the cycle on the contribution of vernaculars to the rise of new cultural participation in Europe and Asia. Today, we will deal with Vietnam, another important country in the vernacular area of East Asia, East Asia in this specific case, but Asia. The title of the lecture today by Professor Tran, Richard Quang-Anh, is the idea of the human in the modern Vietnamese vernacular. Professor Tran is Assistant Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at Foscari University of Venice. So he is one of our esteemed colleagues. He specializes in critical theory, cultural studies, the history and theory of gender, and 19th and 20th century Vietnamese cultural history. He has held postdoctoral fellowship and visiting positions at the National University of Singapore, the University of California, Los Angeles, and the program in critical theory at Berkeley. His book, Queer Vietnam, A History of Gender in the Early 20th Century, 1920-1945, is forthcoming with Stanford University Press. He is an executive board member and treasurer of the Vietnam Studies Group of the Association of Asian Studies. And just to introduce a little bit about the theme that he will be dealing with today, the idea of the human in the modern Vietnamese vernacular. The question of the human remains one of the most contentious issues of our time. It has become central to contemporary critical disputes on a wide range of issues, from LGBTQ rights to environmental sustainability. Yet, the meaning of this term in the Vietnamese context has yet to be explored. This lecture considers both the vocabulary and idea of the human through an examination of debates among Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century. As new concepts emanating from the West were being translated into East and Southeast Asian languages in the early 20th century, Vietnamese intellectuals of the time grappled with the new terms and concepts. One such concept is the relationship between humans and society. Through this debate, the lecture gleans something about the conception of the human in the Vietnamese context. How did Vietnamese intellectuals of the time understand the human? With what is it associated? What is its relationship to the non-human? In examining these questions, the lecture sheds light not only on Vietnam, but also on how the Vietnamese case can help refigure broader contemporary critical disputes. So I now give the floor to Professor Tran. Welcome to our cycle of lectures. Welcome from me, from us, and from all the participating students. Thank you, Richard. Go ahead.
Thank you, Vic. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you, Vicenza, and I would like to thank the Eurasia Foundation as well for this invitation. I'm going to now upload my slides, so give me one moment to do that. Okay, can you all see this? Is that?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so once again, I would like to thank Vicenza Di Urso, Professor Vicenza Di Urso, and also the staff who helped make this possible, Alice and Michaela, and of course also the Eurasia Foundation for their support in making this series of wonderful conferences possible. As Professor De Urso mentioned, the title of my talk is The Idea of the Human in the Modern Vietnamese Vernacular. And this is a project that is ongoing. And so I'm sharing bits and pieces of the research that is in progress right now. And I'm aware that since we have a broad audience with various different backgrounds, I'm going to be providing you with a context along the way for those who may or may not know something about Vietnam. So let's begin. So this is the map of sort of Asia, right, in East Asia. Vietnam is this S-shaped looking country. It looks like a dragon to me. It's almost a small dragon. But that's Vietnam. China's here, so we position it. This is Asia, and so that S there is Vietnam. Moving forward, so the agenda, I'm gonna present the lecture, and then we'll have a brief Q&A at the end. Okay. So my lecture question today is, how did Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century understand the human? So that's sort of the framing question for today's lecture. But to proceed with this particular question, we have to sort of unpack certain assumptions and key terms before we can proceed and answer that question. So let's look at that question carefully. How did Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century understand the human? I'm going to present my thesis to you, and then we're going to unpack the question. So, oh, okay. I was just checking the chat. Okay. So the thesis is, this lecture demonstrates that rather than a signifier for the universal, the idea of the human was still a contested concept among Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century. So that's what I'm going to demonstrate in today's lecture. But before we get to the content, let's look at the question itself. So here's a roadmap. We'll look at the importance of the question. We'll look at some key terms and context, and then we're going to look at briefly the idea of the human in Vietnam's early 20th century. Okay, so the importance of the question. The idea of the human is a principal concept in a wide range of debates. LGBTQ rights today has been framed as human rights. For those who still remember, however, there was a time in recent memory when LGBTQ identities were not considered human rights. And so this is a strategy that was formulated not too long ago. And so there was a time in recent memory when certain identity groups were not considered as the category, as a part of the human. They were very much marginalized and not recognized. And to belong to a particular category could actually be very dangerous, depending where you are, right? Which part of the globe you are, and whether it's recognized by certain groups. And even today, right? If you're in the wrong location on the planet and you are perceived as belonging to a particular identity group, that could be very dangerous, right? It could be threats of persecution, threats of death. And it was the strategy in recent memory by certain activists that certain identities, such as LGBTQ, ought to be under the umbrella of the category of the human in order to shelter them and for them to receive certain kinds of recognition and legal protections. And so it was a strategy that was debated by a lot of activists, intellectuals, academics, and today there are organizations that now have pushed it. I believe the strategy for LGBTQ rights coincided also with women's rights groups too. Again, not too long ago in recent memory, women's rights were also, there were strategies of trying to have that particular category become considered as a human right. So, so the category of the human is a very important critical concept. Another example of how the category of the human is a principal concept today is in environmental sustainability. When we talk about environmental sustainability, we talk about various different particular complex issues. But one particular issue that we talk about is the question of the preservation of future generations, right, of posterity. And why would we want to preserve them? Well, because they belong to the human. We see today activist groups in Italy and in Europe throwing, is it food? They're throwing food at museums in order to protest problems about climate change and environmental degradation. But in the name of what principle? In the name of the human species, of posterity, right? And so younger generations are protesting, saying that there's global warming, there's environmental degradation, and we're the ones who are, in the name of the human, we're the ones who are going to be the recipients of the detrimental consequences of these problems, right? These global problems in climate change and the environment. So what does all this mean? This means that the human is a critical concept precisely because it's a universal signifier, right? And so when we talk about the human, we're talking about a universal signifier, and so when we talk about human rights, we're talking about something that is inherent in all human beings. And that's why the category of the human is so important, right? Because it signifies something that is universal, and it has, it's a universal quality that also garners particular, if you are recognized as part of the human, then you can also simultaneously be the bearer of particular legal rights, right? And so it's a very important category. Okay. So what does this mean? This means that the idea of the human has this kind of universal quality to it, right? When we talk in conversation with each other, sometimes I might say, so what race does that person belong? Or what race do you belong? And they might say, I belong to the human race, right? Why do they say that? Because the human has this universal quality to it. But at the same time, I'm going to suggest that the idea of the human is a normative concept. What do I mean by that? Well, when I say that the idea of the human is a normative concept, I mean that it's not merely descriptive. Descriptive, I mean, we're talking about something that is, right? This flower is yellow, right? This flower is red. It's not just merely descriptive, but it could be a value judgment in the sense of an ought, right? It could be a standard or norm, right? That ought to prevail. So that is where I'm headed in this lecture, right? When I talk about human, I'm not referring to the human in this sort of descriptive sense. How do we know what is human, right? It has X, Y, Z. I'm saying that the human is actually a normative concept. Okay. So these are some of the assumptions undergirding the research question, right? The human is a normative concept, and the idea of the human has a history. What do I mean by the second sense in which the human has a history? Some people might wonder, well, isn't it self-evident if we say that we're all humans? What's the big quandary there, right? Here I'm suggesting that not only is the human a normative concept, but that the human has a history, meaning it changes over time. Our conceptions of the human changes over time. And so those are the two sort of framing assumptions of the research question. To help you understand this, the next slide, yeah, to give an example, to help everyone understand what I mean by the idea that human is a normative concept and that it has a history, meaning it changes over time. Let us look briefly as an example. An example would be slavery and slaves. Now, the picture that you see here is towards the end of the 18th century. So we're looking at the late 1700s. So this would be Europe. This would be North America, the US. This would be Africa. This would be South America. And this is the transatlantic slave trade. So this is the transatlantic slave trade. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton would go to Europe. Textiles, rum, and manufacturers would go to Africa. And then from Africa, slaves would be shipped across to, it would also be shipped to South America, it would be shipped to the Caribbean, but pretty much North America, right? North America, it was also shipped to South America as well. But it was known as the transatlantic slave trade. And the middle passage was the passage from Africa to North America. And you would have ships of African slaves who would be shipped away across what was called the Middle Passage. And this would be around the late 1700s, so towards the end of the 18th century. The transatlantic triangular trade started to develop. And why am I presenting this as an example in history? Because slaves were not considered people at that time. They were considered commodities to be shipped across, just objects, right? They were considered objects. They were not considered people. And then in US history, for example, slaves were not a complete person. They were counted for the purposes of taxation. For slaveholders, they were not an entire person. But for the purposes of taxation, if you were a slaveholder, the slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation. And it was only through a particular moment in time that this particular horrific practice became questioned. And it became questioned through particular ideas of what the human is, right? And so I present this example to show you that the idea of the human is at once normative and historical. Normative in the sense that we think that we know what the human is. Someone walks across the street and we say, oh, that's a human, right? But when you look at history in the broad view, not just at this particular moment, but we step back and look at the broad view of history, not everyone has been recognized as human, right? Not everyone has been recognized as human, which means that the idea and the concept of human is at once normative and historical. Okay. Okay, let's move. So those are the two framing assumptions, what I mean by the human, that the human is an evolving concept. Okay, so the idea of the human as history means it changes over time. And if it's a normative concept and it changes over time, then that means that if we can understand how the idea of the human has evolved over time, and it's understood in particular times and places and by particular cultures, then we can more effectively engage with contemporary debates about the human. So when we talk about how particular groups, LGBTQ groups, if we talk about environmental sustainability, if we understand the history of this particular critical concept, we can more effectively engage with certain contemporary debates. And in this case, in particular locations, and in this case, Vietnam. Okay, so that's sort of the framing premise of the project. Okay, so now let's look at some key terms and context. Again, how did Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century understand the human? So we have some certain key terms within the question. We have Vietnamese intellectuals, we have early 20th century, and of course, there's that key term, the human, which I've discussed briefly. Here, I want to talk about three particular issues in the question: Vietnamese intellectuals, early 20th century. And again, I'm aware that this is a very diverse audience with various different backgrounds, and so I'm providing the context, so everyone is on the same page. I know there's some of my students there who may know some of this already, and that's fine. But the context needs to be covered for a wide audience. Okay. Okay, so the early 20th century in Vietnam. What's so special about the early 20th century in Vietnam, right? That's okay. So the early 20th century, if we look at Vietnam, not just Vietnam, but East Asia in general, the early 20th century was a pivotal moment. What were some of the features of the early 20th century? One particular feature of the early 20th century in many parts of East Asia, of Vietnam in particular, East Asia in general, is the collapse of the dynastic systems in East Asia. For much of East Asia before the 20th century, what we had were dynastic systems, right? So in China, we had the fall of the Qing Empire around 1911, 1912. So China was, as with many other parts of East Asia, was ruled by dynastic systems. Japan encountered their modernization a little bit earlier, right? They had the Tokugawa period for 300 years. They were pretty much closed, and then their modernization appeared in the middle of the 19th century. So we're talking about the 1800s with the Meiji Restoration. So Japan encountered this much earlier. With China, the Qing Empire collapsed in the early 20th century, around 1911. In the case of Vietnam, throughout the 19th century, we had the Nguyen dynasty. Starting around 1801, we had the establishment of the Nguyen dynasty. And it was with the Nguyen dynasty that we had for the first time, Vietnam looks like it's S-shaped. Let me go back to that earlier slide. Okay. So we have Vietnam, this S shape here, right? It was in 1801, beginning 1801, with the rise of the Nguyen dynasty in the 19th century, that we have the formation of this S shape. Before then, Vietnam was fragmented with all sorts of different fiefdoms. It was divided in various different fragments, but it was in the 19th century that you had the Nguyen dynasty that created this modern S shape that we see today that looks like a dragon. So let me move back to this. Every 20th century collapse of dynastic systems. Here it is. So the Nguyen dynasty emerges around the beginning of the 19th century, and they try to create networks, road systems, and a variety of different institutions and various ways to create that S shape that we see today. And it was the Nguyen dynasty that lasted from the beginning of the 19th century pretty much all the way through close to the middle of the 20th century, before the middle of the 20th century, when it finally just collapsed. But something happens during the Nguyen dynasty that would change the future of Vietnam forever, which is the arrival, the advent of French colonialism. So the French arrive, French colonialism begins in 1862. And it begins in 1862. And so the case of Vietnam, you have the Nguyen dynasty from the 19th century through approximately the middle of the 20th century. But the Nguyen dynasty is significantly weakened by the end of the 19th century, and it becomes pretty much, eventually it just becomes mostly a symbolic figure in the 20th century, once at the late stages of French colonialism. Eventually, the Nguyen dynasty would collapse in the 20th century. And so, again, what is so significant about the early 20th century? You see the collapse of dynastic systems in East Asia throughout. It happens in China, it happens in Vietnam, it happened much earlier in Japan. So that's one significant feature of the early 20th century. Okay, what is another significant feature of the early 20th century? Another significant feature is the rise of modern state systems. In the case of China, you have the Republican period, right? After the fall of the Qing period, the Qing dynasty, you have the rise of Republican China. In the case of Vietnam, it's slightly different, but the overall trend is still the same. After the arrival of the French in the middle of the 19th century, they would metaphorically and literally reconfigure the country, right? And modernize many of its infrastructures and the landscape of the country. By the late 19th century, pretty much Vietnam was now the dynastic system. Many of the infrastructure of the dynastic system was completely vitiated. And in its place, modern infrastructure systems were built. And so though the Vietnamese case, you still had this dynastic system through the 20th century. It still had the resurrection, the erection of this modern state system. It would be called colonial modernity in the case of Vietnam. Of course, in China, you had Republican China by the 20th century, but in Vietnam, the Nguyen dynasty was still there in its symbolic form in the 20th century, but a colonial modern state system was erected. So another trend that you see in the early 20th century, besides the collapse of the dynastic system, is the rise of a modern state system. And I have a picture to help you with this. So in Vietnam, you have the rise of modern state systems, but under colonial rule, so modern colonial state. So the French arrived in the South. You can see the years here, right? 1862 to 67. And they annexed the South, and they eventually moved up, right? 1862, 1883, 1884. And as you can see, they start annexing other parts of mainland, this would be called Indochina, right? But mainland Southeast Asia, right? So this would be sort of contemporary Vietnam. You have Cambodia, you have Laos here. But as you can see, if you look at the dates, by the early 20th century, right, you have pretty much the formation of modern Indochina, right? And so Vietnam, like China and other parts of Asia in the early 20th century, there's the creation of a modern state, right? But in the case of Vietnam, it's a modern colonial state. Okay. What else is important about the early 20th century that we need to know, some background context to understand this particular research project or research question here? Something that is very important is the emergence of the modern Vietnamese vernacular written in the Romanized script. Okay, so here's sort of a little chart to help everyone take a look here. And I'm aware that I believe, okay, well, let's look at this. So here's the English, right? Here's the English meaning. This is the Chinese modern pinyin. These are the Chinese characters, and these are the Vietnamese words. Now, before the 20th century, Vietnam had various different sort of idioms, right? You had literary Chinese, which was the language of government and bureaucracy. You had Chữ Nôm, which was the Vietnamese vernacular, which was an adapted form of literary Semitic, right? That captured the sounds of the Vietnamese. I don't have it, I think it's here. I have it here. So this would be Nôm down here, but it's hard to see. But anyway, then by the early 20th century, what was developed was what was called Quốc ngữ, the national script. And that's what's on the very left-hand column. By the 20th century, you have the Romanized script, the development of the Vietnamese language in Romanized script. Before that, you didn't have that. Vietnamese used Literary Semitic for bureaucracy and the language of government, and Junol, which was its own vernacular idiom. And then in the early 20th century, you had the explosion of the Vietnamese Romanized language. And so that was a very critical development, a crucial development in the early 20th century for many different reasons. But one particular reason is that the Romanization of the language facilitated mass literacy. And there's also studies showing that it also contributed to various different movements, such as nationalism. The Romanization of the language is much easier to learn for the masses. And so there was an explosion. There was an explosion of a print public culture. So in the early 20th century, you have another feature that's specific to the Vietnamese context is the rise of print culture and public debate. With the Romanization of the language and also the availability of the printed press, there was this explosion of writing in the modern vernacular and public debate. And so you have lots and lots of textual sources during this period. Okay. So in summary, what is so special about the early 20th century? We see at least 4 features. We see the collapse of dynastic systems in East Asia. We see the rise of modern state systems. We observe the emergence of the modern Vietnamese vernacular written in the Romanized script. And finally, as a result of the third feature, you also see the fourth, which is the rise of print culture, the efflorescence of writing and public debate in the modern vernacular. Okay. I want to pause and ask if there are any questions, but maybe we can save that for later. Okay, let's proceed. If we were in a classroom, I would pause and ask if there are questions. But okay. Okay, so another term within the question is Vietnamese intellectuals, right? So we have to, the question is posed, but we need to make sure that we understand each of the terms of the question. So what do I mean by Vietnamese intellectuals? Vietnamese intellectuals during this period, you see at least 2 groups. The first group would be the scholarcentric generation. So this would be the group who were born in the 19th century, but who lived through the 20th century. And what is so significant about that? The significance is precisely because of the enormous changes that have happened, that have transpired between the 19th and the 20th century. That some of the vast transformations that I just described in the earlier slide, right? So this is a generation that was born in the 19th century, and they were trained in classical Chinese, right? They grew up in these families, and they were trained in classical Chinese and were studying to pass the Mandarin Civil Service examinations to become a part of the dynastic system, the Nguyen dynastic system. But what is so problematic about that? Some of you might be able to piece this together already, right? What is so problematic about this? If you were born in the 19th century, you were studying so hard to study classical Chinese so you can pass the Mandarin Civil Service examinations to work for the Nguyen dynasty, so you can pass and hope to work for the Nguyen dynasty. What is problematic about this during this period? As you can well imagine, based on the history that I just described to you, the Nguyen dynasty was at its peak, right, in the early 19th century, but by the middle of the 19th century, with the advent of French colonialism, the dynastic system, Nguyen dynasty, became vitiated. And in many parts of East Asia, as I just told you earlier, by the early 20th century, many of these dynastic systems were collapsing one after another. The Nguyen dynasty in the 20th century was arguably mostly symbolic by the 20th century, right? And the Mandarin Civil Service examinations ended in Vietnam, it ended around 1918. In China, it ended much earlier. It ended much earlier in China, but in Vietnam, it ended much later, around 1918. But what does this mean? This means that many of this scholar genre generation were studying for something that was no longer existent, right, by the middle of the 20th century. In any case, they were still an intellectual presence in the early 20th century, and they contribute to a lot of writing, right, in both the 19th and early 20th century. Okay, let's move along. Okay, another group would be the younger generation, right? And this would be the early 20th century. Younger generation of Vietnamese intellectuals, mostly Western educated, right? You have the advent of French colonialism by the middle of the 19th century. By the early 20th century, that would be the late French colonial period, right? And so you have a younger generation that was mostly Western educated. They knew French, they were multilingual, some were raised within a new Confucian upbringing, but their particular worldview was a radical departure from the prior generation, who were steeped within the East Asian classics. The prior generation was trained in classical Chinese. They were steeped within the East Asian classics. Most of their knowledge of Western political theory came by way of translation, which we're going to talk about in the next point. So what we see in the early 20th century is this juxtaposition, this mingling of these two generations, this earlier scholar genre generation and a younger generation. Okay. There's a lot more. I'm giving you just very brief context to help you understand. Okay, and then the third point here is the translation of modern concepts in East Asia. This has to do with the concept of the human and other particular concepts. So we covered early 20th century, the term early 20th century. We've talked about Vietnamese intellectuals. I've already spoken briefly about the importance of the idea of the human in contemporary times, but it is one concept among other critical concepts, right? And another particular phenomenon that we need to talk about is translation, right? Okay, so let's take a look. So in early 20th century, many modern concepts emanating from the West came to East Asia. Now, this phenomenon was different depending on where you were in East Asia. The phenomenon, it's a very complex phenomenon, but it was a phenomenon whereby intellectuals in East Asia were trying to formulate terms for concepts in Western political theory, right? So concepts such as the idea, we're going to look at one example later. Contemporary Western political theory would have concepts such as society, right? The public, right? Democracy. All of these terms were entering East Asia, and East Asian intellectuals had to figure out a way to translate them. And the process of translation was complex, right? This is where ideas about the territorial integrity of particular terms is challenged when you look at how these terms cross-pollinate, right? Many of these terms entered, they were translated beginning in Japan, right? With the Meiji Restoration in the middle of the 19th century. So as I told you earlier in this particular narrative, Japan began its process of modernization much earlier than China and Vietnam with the Meiji Restoration of the 19th century. So it was Japan that had to grapple with trying to translate some of these modern concepts. And so many of these terms, the Japanese intellectuals translated these concepts by using certain terms within classical Chinese, right? So they borrowed classical Chinese terms, translated it. Those translated terms then was imported back into mainland China. Then from mainland China, it migrated down to Vietnam. And so that's the trajectory. And that explains in part sort of the interrelatedness, right, of many of these countries today, despite claims of particular forms of territorial integrity, right? You see this sort of cross-cultural and linguistic pollination. Okay, so that's what's happening. There are translations of modern concepts in East Asia, and East Asian intellectuals had to translate foreign concepts, unknown concepts in Western political theory. Okay, let's take a look at a particular example. And this provides us with both linguistic and historical perspective. So the idea of society, society today, we take for granted as a commonplace term. We all know what society is. We think it's universal, right? We think it's completely universal. Everyone uses it. But if we look at this, the history of this particular term, both the history and its meaning, it's a very interesting history. Why is that? The word for society in English is just society. The translation today is this in Vietnamese, xã hội. The term in traditional script, in traditional Chinese script, right, is 社会, right? This is the term for society. Today, we take this term for granted. We think we all know what society is, but when we look at it, we realize that the term itself doesn't exist before the 20th century in Vietnam. It appears in Vietnam sometime between 1900 and 1902. You look at all the sources, it does not appear anywhere before the 20th century. What does that mean? That means that the term is historical, right? It has a history, right? It's not universal for all times and places, even though it's a term today that we look at and we're like, oh, we all know what it is. Everyone knows what it is, right? And it's completely universal. But when we look at it, that's actually not the case. It did not exist anywhere in Vietnam before the 20th century. What did exist before the 20th century in Vietnam then? Before 1900 in Vietnam, we see the word société, the French word, appeared in Vietnamese in around 1884. Then we ask ourselves, okay, so the word société in French appeared in 1884. Then what about ça and hội? What does that mean? The term hội in Vietnamese before the 20th century referred to a commercial group or a guild. Similar to sort of, so a commercial group or a guild. And then the word ça, back then as it is today, can mean a rural community or small organization. So that's very strange. So xã hội did not appear. That's because the idea of society was a concept emanating from the West, right? It was an abstract concept emanating from the West that was then migrated to East Asia, and East Asian intellectuals had to figure out a term for this. This term has a long history, but it was, again, the history that I told you earlier. It began with Japanese intellectuals trying to figure out a translation, a term for this particular, for the word society. And it was Japanese intellectuals who borrowed Chinese, classical Chinese, to come up with a term. Then it was then exported from Japan to China, and then from China, it migrated its way to Vietnam. And by the early 20th century, Vietnam then had the term xã hội, meaning society. This is very powerful because imagine if you lived in a world where you didn't have this word. Imagine if you lived in a world where the word society did not exist, right? If the word doesn't even exist, your concept of it would be completely something else, right? You can't even envision, you don't even have a word for society. You can envision what it is. You would probably need some other particular word or concept. And that is the case. Before the 20th century, you had the word hội, which is commercial groups or guilds. You have the word xã, which is a rural community or small organization. Why is that? Well, some scholars believe that the reason Vietnam didn't have the word society before the 20th century is that in the 19th century in Vietnam, which was dominated by Neo-Confucianism, the Nguyen dynasty was one of the periods in Vietnam where you had, it was one of the heights of Neo-Confucianism. I've taught this before in one of my earlier classes. In different periods of time, you have other particular paradigms that were much stronger. But in the Nguyen 19th century, Neo-Confucianism was one of the strongest paradigms. And the Confucian paradigm was not concerned with groups of people, right? The Confucian paradigm was concerned with relationships of people, right? Your particular obligation to another person, right? That is what Neo-Confucianism was interested in. It was a moral paradigm of how you should relate to others, right? To the king, to the father, if you are in a particular state, if you are in the family, it's a paradigm based on your moral obligation and relationship to others. It was not interested in groups of people, which is what the concept of society is about. And so scholars believe that that's one reason why the term society did not exist in Vietnam before the 20th century. So this is an example showing us both many of the concepts that I just talked about, right? About the particular time period, about intellectuals, about the translation of concepts in East Asia and in Vietnam. Okay, so moving on. I know I think I need to move a little bit faster because I want to keep this to an hour. Okay. Now we're going to get to the third part of the idea of the human in Vietnam's early 20th century. Now, to understand this, we need to put this in perspective. The human in classical East Asia, we have three main paradigms, minimally three main paradigms. We have Neo-Confucianism, which understood the human as a subject formed through moral self-cultivation. Neo-Confucianism, as soon as you're born into this world, you're not necessarily human. This is the Neo-Confucian paradigm. And the human for the Neo-Confucian paradigm is a cultivated subject. It takes a lot of effort, right? You need to know the classics, you need moral self-cultivation, you need to follow the Confucian virtues. Only through all of that do you then become recognized as the human in the Neo-Confucian paradigm. That's one paradigm. Let's take a look at it. The Taoist paradigm, the human is a subject exhibiting uninhibited spontaneity in unison with nature, right? That's the Taoist paradigm. And then you have the Buddhist paradigm. The human is a sentient being in the endless cycles of transmigration. These are some of the main paradigms of the human in classical East Asia. There's a lot more. I'm providing, again, mostly context so you can understand. Again, 19th century, arguably the strongest paradigm in 19th century Vietnam and arguably in the early 20th century would be Neo-Confucianism, where the human is a subject formed through moral self-cultivation. It is not self-evident that any particular subject is human until they have cultivated particular virtues, right? It takes a lot of effort, and it's not easy to attain or be recognized as the subject of the human in the Neo-Confucian paradigm. Okay, so the idea of the human in the Vietnamese context in the early 20th century, what is it, right? This is a big question mark. There's different terminologies for it. One term is Nhân Sinh, right? People born into this world, and along with Nhân Sinh, you have Nhân Sinh Quang, meaning a person's worldview. But we don't really understand how the Vietnamese received this. It may be the case that Vietnam was influenced by some of these particular paradigms within East Asia, but it remains a question as to their interrelationship and dynamics of how of the interactions and dynamics of how this of that particular concept of the human, right? How did the Vietnamese receive and translate particular concepts? What innovations emerged? I'm going to suggest that in the early 20th century, there was still much contestation over this particular concept, right? There was a wide-ranging debate about what the human is or was, is, and ought to be. And that's what I'm suggesting. And I can give you 3 examples. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this. I'm going to look at a short story, a literary debate, and then the reception of an epic poem, a now national classic. And I'm going to have to give you some context for each of these. And I know that I'm running out of time, so this will be, again, very cursory. The first one is a story published in 1930 by the Vietnamese author, Quang-Anh. He's a very well-known author in Vietnam. He grew up with a Neo-Confucian background, so that's something interesting. There's a lot more I could say, but the story is about a rickshaw puller who, a destitute rickshaw puller who's trying to bring home bread for himself and his family, and he unfortunately finds a client who herself is a prostitute without any income, and she's trying to find clients, and so he pulls her around, pretty much transports her all around the old quarter in Hanoi throughout the night, and she's trying to look for clients but can't find any clients, and she doesn't have any money. And at the end, she finally confesses, and he realizes that he has spent the entire evening trying to transport a client with no money. She doesn't find any clients, and he, in the end, is left again destitute and has lost the entire evening trying to transport a client who doesn't have money, so he doesn't have money to bring home for himself and his family. And so that's what the story is about. For those students who were in my class, we read another story called I Pulled a Rickshaw by the author Tam Lang. That story is a different story, but this, as you can see, there's sort of parallel themes here, right? But Quang-Anh is a very interesting author because he titled the story Ngui Ngui. And so I roughly translated as Horse Humans and Human Horses. And it's a very interesting title. I don't have time to go into all of it here, but he's definitely using the rhetorical technique of a chiasmus, right? This is the rhetorical figure of a chiasmus, of horse, humans, and human horses. The chiasmus is a rhetorical figure whereby you invert. You have A, B, and then you invert B, A, right? That's the rhetorical technique of a chiasmus, and he's using that rhetorical technique to show the interpenetration of the human and the animal, right? Horse and humans, human horses. What is the distinction between them, if at all? There's a lot more I can say about this particular story, but the background, the fact that he has a Neo-Confucian background has now juxtapose the human and the animal suggests what? It suggests, and you know that earlier I told you about the Neo-Confucian paradigm. The human is not something that is easy to achieve, right? It's something that requires a lot of work. And his critique of the human as having fallen to the level of the animal is quite clear through the rhetorical figure of the chiasmus here, right? Okay. There's a lot more, but this is sort of brief. Cursory. So this is one example of a human that has descended to the level of the animal. There's another piece of evidence. This, I can't present all of it. It's like pages and pages. It's like over 200 documents. But there's a raging debate in the early 20th century on the relationship between art and humans. Vietnamese intellectuals would engage in pen wars over the relationship between art and humans. And I can't present all of it here, but looking at various particular themes in this particular debate between art and humans. And this debate was an offshoot of the debate happening also in France about whether art is for art's sake or is art for human's sake, right? Looking at this particular debate, we can see particular strands. Sometimes the human is synonymous with the living organism. Sometimes the human is synonymous with the idea of society. And at times in this particular debate, the human is synonymous with the proletariat. So you see sort of the nascent strand of the Marxist and communist strand here. So in this particular debate, you see the human understood in a biological sense. You see the human understood in a sociological sense, and you see the human understood in its economic political sense. Okay, let's move to the third example, where I'm suggesting again that the concept of the human is highly contested in this period. The Tale of Q. Now, the Tale of Q is an epic poem, and it's today a national classic in Vietnam. And it tells of the story of a heroine, a female protagonist, who sells her body in order to save her father and her family from debt. And it's a national classic. And what I'm interested in here is not the particularities of the story itself, but its reception by Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century. By reception, I mean, how did Vietnamese intellectuals understand the story? We can read a particular story, it's the same story, but it's going to change from one person to another, from particular time periods to another. An example would be Dante, right? Dante's story is there, but in particular periods of time, people might understand Dante's story differently, right? So that's what I'm interested in, the reception of how the Tale of Q was received. What I'm particularly interested in is the figure of Q, and the transition in understanding her as a prostitute. Early 20th century Vietnamese intellectuals looked at the Tale of Q. Some liked the story, some didn't like it. But when you look at the objections of the story, it's very peculiar because they saw her and they saw a dirty prostitute. If you go back into time and looked at a different period of time, they might read it and they say, oh, she's not a prostitute. She's an exclusive courtesan, right? Courtesan. But by the early 20th century, the way some interpreters read this female heroine, is that she was a prostitute. What I'm suggesting here is that there has been some kind of a change, a dispute in the very category of the human through the reception of this particular story. I can't go into all the details here. I'm running out of time, but those are the three examples that I want to present to you to show that the concept of human in the early 20th century was still very highly contested. Okay. I think I'm going to wrap up here. So the question is, how did Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century understand the human? And as I've suggested, this lecture has demonstrated that rather than a signifier for the universal, the idea of the human was still a contested concept among Vietnamese intellectuals in the early 20th century. So we've looked at the importance of the question, some key trends and context, and some examples in the Vietnamese culture history. Okay, so thank you for your attention. Shall we, do we have time for some questions and answers, or we could take that later, or facilitators?
Yes, I'm here. We are all here. Actually, if you want, you can have some more time if you need to add something. If you feel the need that that something has not been said, but for me this was quite illuminating. Your lecture was quite illuminating. It in some cases it overlaps with and I guess it's normal for all these countries that come out of the Chinese, the Sinosphere, and the Chinese control and the Chinese. So the idealism that China is, the master of and the center of the universe and everything. So sorry, I have to open also my my video. I always forget it. In Korea, there are, you know, very, very similar passages. And one that comes to my mind now is, I took some notes, but one that comes to my mind is the translation, the importance of translation, the passage, so of the concepts through China and then back. In the case of Korea, it's through Japan and then back. So it would also be interesting to analyze and to maybe look more into depth into this kind of roles that that translation itself of ideas from the West happen to be realized and translated and, you know, conceptualized. Another thing that it's very, very common to Korea is also the idea of the prostitute. I've studied kiseng, these courtesans in Korea. My 40 years ago PhD, 30 years ago PhD was on them. Of course, today I would write in a different way. But the concept of a kiseng in the primary sources of the 16th century, 15th and 16th century, this concept describes them as artists, as musicians. So if you find them in vocabularies, so in dictionaries, in the first dictionary of the 1527, a kiseng is a woman, a young woman, able to play a string instrument. This is the exact translation, so the exact description of the concept. But then at the end of the 19th century, in French Korean dictionary or English Korean dictionary, you find it described as prostitute. So exactly the same, exactly the same. So this is quite, quite illuminating, and we tend, there should really be more exchanges into, of these ideas and these experiences, because I know that geisha is still a different concept, but for Korea, even descendants and relatives of famous kiseng during the early 20th century, they were ashamed of telling about this. I met some people back in the days. Now there is no more old kiseng alive. I mean, because the time really passes and takes them away. But there were, and I saw some photos of them, and some beautiful photos, and also some kind of short videos. But the thing is that they were ashamed of speaking about this relationship because of the prostitute tag that was put on these women. So, I mean, this is quite, really quite exciting, and I hope we can do something together about this too. Maybe we can write something together, Richard, because this is really lovely. And, but anyway, this was my comment. Some of the comments that came out, the history of the idea of human, of the concept of human, is also quite interesting and challenging. But now I would like to leave the floor to the students who participated, or they're still here, because, and I know that also some of your students are participating. So welcome. We reached the number of 64 people present. I mean, if you take away 4, it's 60, because you, me, and then Alicia and Michela, we are 4. Then all the rest is just participants, and you know, it's your public, your audience. So I'm, you know, really glad for this very, very beautiful result. We will certainly propose the same cycle of lectures also for next year, but maybe on a different angle of the vernacularity, a different angle, also related to our research project, because this is on it, so it's all connected. But I really now, I know that you also would like to have questions about your presentation. So please, students and, you know, listeners, all participants, please ask questions. This is a special occasion. We have Professor Tran here with us, so please ask. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Vicenza. No, I think it's your comment is actually very perspicacious and on point. Is that there's so many sort of parallel sort of cultural histories that are not yet sort of have been productively. There isn't this kind of conversation, right? There's sort of silos, but there isn't that kind of cross sort of cultural collaboration, right? And so there's all these histories that have yet to be sort of compared, right? In a productive way. But that could be a future project, right?
Exactly. Well, actually, I have an idea for another one.
Oh, really?
Yes, but so if you can stay over, you know, when everybody's gone, if we can stay over, because we it was talked about yesterday in the you know, in the meeting. But yeah, here there is one question. So we talk later about this. There is one question in the chat room. Can you access the chat room,
yes.
Richard?
Yes. So let me read the question. It says, how was the LGBT community perceived in Vietnam before the arrival of the French and the introduction of Christian ideas? That's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. To answer that question, as is typical of my both my historical and philosophical training, I'm going to start looking at the terms of the question. So when we say LGBT community, I understand you to mean sort of the lesbian, gay, and bisexual, transgender community. There's sort of two particular ways to answer that question. The first would be to look at the particular terms of LGBT, right? When we say LGBT, we have to ask ourselves, is that a particular identity that, let me answer it two ways. Let me answer it the first way, and then I'll answer it the second way. If we're talking about sort of non-normative sort of genders and identities, and those subjects who have non-normative erotic desires, in the history of sort of East Asia in general, and Vietnam in particular, gender variant subjects, gender variant sexual subjects, there wasn't, generally speaking, there was more of a space of tolerance for them. If we're talking sort of generally speaking in the realm of East Asia. The second sort of answer I have to this particular question is to encourage you to think about the very particular terms that we're using. The idea of LGBT, for example, the identity itself has a particular history. It emerged at a particular time in history. And so that would be the sort of the second answer that I would have to you. which is a problematization of the very shape and form of the question. But I understand the spirit of your question, right? And the spirit of the question is, what about the status and place of non-normative genders and subjects with non-normative erotic subjectivities, right? The general answer to that would be that there's more of a space for them. That would be the general answer. I would have to complexify it, but that would be the general answer. In Vietnam, the Neo-Confucian system was not, they had other kinds of concerns, right? They were more concerned about the particular order of their paradigm. So long as their particular Neo-Confucian paradigm was not challenged, they were very tolerant. They were not concerned about these kinds of particular questions. So long as their particular sort of Neo-Confucian world order was not challenged, they were not concerned about it. So you can have, you can have cases of male homoerotic subjectivities and practices, and they would not be concerned about it, so long as there was not a challenge to the Neo-Confucian order. That would be sort of the general answer I have. So there's a two-pronged answer there for you. There's the general answer to sort of just answer your question, and then there's also the second question to help you reflect on the particular shape and form of your question. And so my question, I can't see you. If I can see you, I would have a conversation with you about this, Alice. It's a very good question. It's an excellent question. So the first answer I gave to you is sort of just sort of the direct general answer. And then the second answer would be to encourage you to think about, does the term LGBT have a history, right? When did it appear, right? When did these identities appear? How and why? And can we transpose the term LGBT to another time and place? So that would be sort of my sort of second question to you for further sort of reflection. I hope that helps. I can't see you, but I hope that helps answer your question. It's an excellent question.
Any other questions? Thank you for the first one, because this was really a very good question. I agree with you, Richard. While we wait for other questions to pop up, I have another one. Well, I have a real one. So related to the concept of human, we know that now, so there is the environmental issues, there is the humanity issue, but nowadays in the West and in other countries, not only in let's say in Europe or in the States, these so-called Western countries, some new paradigm is coming up, and it's the one within environmental groups, and it's the one that we are one with the nature. So the human being in the sense of men and women, so persons, are one with the nature, and so we don't have to put the human first and then the rest later. So we are all part of an organic so together being, and so we are all related. So I wonder, is this concept of human changing again, and including, so becoming not anymore human but living beings? So in Buddhism, of course, we are all sentient beings. So this is something that it's not new to the East, so-called East Asia, the Buddhist influence area. But then we also find very bad treatment of animals in some areas. Well, everywhere. So I wonder if now this human concept is changing into some more, a wider concept, so that we are all being part of, we go back to the concept, the Buddhist concept of, being part of a huge, holistic kind of, world.
Right. No, that is an excellent question. Thank you so much for this precious question, Vicenza. I think one of my underlying motivations in this particular research project is precisely to engage with sort of the emergent scholarly studies questioning sort of the Anthropocene, right? The Anthropocene meaning the environmental consequences and more as a result of the rise of human beings, right? Of the anthropocentric paradigm of human at the center, right? And the climate and environmental crisis that we're all facing as a result of human hands, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And we're probably facing it today in Italy, in Europe, in the US, everywhere, right? And I think in order to understand these emergent sort of paradigms, especially in the environmental humanities, we need a clear idea of how different civilizations, cultures understood the concept of the human in relation to the environment, for example, in relation to the non-human, right? The subhuman, the superhuman, right? We need a clear grasp of that concept before we can engage in debate with these emergent and important intellectual paradigms. So my motivation in this particular project is also to eventually engage with those emergent paradigms as well. Those are very important paradigms. So that's an excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Richard. Students, other questions, other curiosities?
Well, we can take a break. We can just take a break now and have conversations after.
Here, another one. Another one, Nicola Danieletto. It's in the chat room.
Okay. So one of my students, my brilliant students. Okay, so first, let me read Nicola's question. First of all, thank you for your insightful presentation. What I would like to ask you is, since the Jesuit missionaries which came to Vietnam around the 17th century were among the first Europeans to produce a corpus of translations into Vietnamese, to what extent did they were influenced by the human in Vietnam, where their translations later being revived? Very good question. Here we're going to be looking at the direction here would be the relationship with Jesuit translations. We'll be looking at the intersections of religion, right? We'll be looking at religious paradigms of the human. So Catholicism, definitely the history of Catholicism is an integral part of Vietnamese history, especially in the 19th century. Very interesting. If you look at the history of, this is something that I think I would respond to Nicola in person, because we're going to get into very technical questions of Vietnamese history. But in the early 19th century, the founder of the Nguyen dynasty was very welcoming of Westerners, and he welcomed Catholics, he welcomed Westerners, he had Westerners as honorary mandarins in his dynasty. And then after the founder of the Nguyen dynasty passed away, his sons, some of his sons were less welcoming, right? They were less open and there was persecutions of Catholics in the Yuan dynasty, as in the hands of the heir of the Yuan dynasty's founder. So the sons, some of his sons, were not very, they were hostile, and so there were persecutions. And arguably, as a result of some of these persecutions, this made its way to France and also to Rome, right? And arguably, this could be a contributing factor to that shaped the future of Vietnam, because that arguably contributed to the arrival of the French, right? Or at least one of their reported reasons. So here we're talking about the idea of the human with the intersection of a religious paradigm. We're looking at the religious paradigm in the early 20th century. The question would be, to what extent would some of these religious paradigms, Catholic paradigms, play a role? That's very, in the sources that I examined, Nicola, it's a very good question. And there are definitely scholars in Vietnam studies interested in Catholicism. In the sources that I studied and the examples that I presented to you, the religious paradigm of the human, I didn't see too many of it. That's not to say that Catholicism doesn't play an important role, as there are clearly many studies on this. But the sources that I looked at, I don't see too much of an influence. This would have to be looked at more carefully, but it's an excellent question. But but yeah, the sources that I looked at, I did not see too many influence of this religious paradigm. But it's an integral part of 19th century and 20th century Vietnamese history, as you may be aware. But thank you for that question.
Richard, so this is really, I also think that this question was quite interesting. The last part where he asks, where Nicola, your student, asks where their translations later being revived. This also puts the centrality on the translation itself, on the translation activity as itself, because then it brings up also the need for translations to be modernized, to be revised. Revived, it's of course a bit different, but revised is also, I think, included in this concept. And so it would be also interesting to see if there has been a revision or a revival of these kind of translations in Vietnam, and how. And I think this could also help, your project or your research, ongoing research project on the concept of human. So, and actually, again, this is a transversal, this is a transnational reality, because Korea was not so generous towards Westerners, at least until the end of the 19th century, when it was forced to open up its doors. Korea was the last one, the last of the East Asian countries to open up to Westerners. But in terms of Catholicism, it was actually the only one who formed a Catholic church from itself, without the need of any missionaries, because of the travel to China, this contacts with China. They brought back books by missionaries translated in Chinese, of course, in classical Chinese, And then and they read those books, and they spread the religion, the Catholic word, the Catholic religion by themselves. Of course, there were also persecutions. There were lots of of priests and believers killed, lots of martyrs, but this kind of theme could become a transversal theme all over Asia. And really, thank you, Nicola Danieletto, for this question, because from questions then other answers or other questions also arise. It's always very, very stimulating and very interesting. Any other questions? Any other comments? Please. So yesterday we had, the day before yesterday, we had a meeting with a poet, a living poet from Korea. And then one student wrote me in the afternoon asking me something about the poet. And I said, well, I don't know this exact aspect, so I would have to ask her, but why didn't you ask her in the morning? She was there. Why am I saying this? Because Professor Tran, I'm saying this to all the students, all the participants, Professor Tran is here with us today. So please, once we close the connection, then you can only write to him. But maybe we would like to know also. We would like to know his answers and your questions. So please do not be timid and ask.
Well, we had some very good, excellent questions already.
Yeah,
so
definitely. Definitely.
And questions that really lead to further questions and reflection and critical thought, right? So some excellent questions already from Alice and from Nicola and my conversations with Professor Buurstrom. So I'm here. I'm part of Foscari. So do this over a spritz or a cafe. So
exactly. All right. I don't know. I mean, it's 10:30. Alice, how are we doing with the time?
No problem. If the professor has done, we can just finish here. No problem.
Mm-hmm. So, well, if and could we stay over for some more time and speak?
Yes,
Professor.
I just asked Professor Tran to stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
So, Vincenza, if you wanted to do the final greetings, then I'll give you the organization of the meeting, and then you can.
Can you put again the poster on so I can conclude also this? Thank you. So Professor Tran, dear Professor Tran, dear students, dear participants, and dear Alice and Michela, who helped us in putting together all our efforts and have also this 15th lecture within the cycle on vernacularity between Europe and Asia. Thank you very much for your help, for your participation, for your insights, for your questions, for your comments. This was again another a lecture that was very, very stimulating for us and has opened up another world, the Vietnamese voice within the vernacularity. So thank you very much. We conclude here the 15th lecture entitled The Idea of the Human in the Modern Vietnamese Vernacular. we will see us next week. We are almost at the end of this cycle. Thank you once again to everybody. And thanks to Eurasia Foundation. Next week, we will have the president of the Eurasia Foundation intervening from Japan. Last week
Vincenza, it's the next again.
there
Before
is
the
25th. The 25th.
Yes, but there is Michael Pettit before.
No, but I said next week.
Okay.
Next week. So that was correct. And so next week we will have, the president of the Eurasia Foundation meeting us as well. Of course, we have 2 more lectures. My lecture will be there too. Really, we can close here for today, but we will see again next week, and I hope that Richard and other participants as well will be able to, to be present to the lecture by the president of the Eurasia Foundation from Tokyo. So thank you again, and see you next week. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Grazie studenti. Arrivederci.